In the early hours of the morning on December 11, 2003, Rick and Susanna Wamsley got a grim surprise when 3 people broke into their house and set about trying to kill them. Why that was happening was unclear, and who the people even were at first was fuzzy. But one thing Rick knew was that if he wanted to get out of the situation alive, he was going to have to fight back. And so that's what he did when, after being shot in the head not long after his wife had been executed while sleeping, he somehow maintained enough strength to enter into a scuffle with the 3 assailants. And it was at that point, right before he was shot again and ultimately killed, that he discovered that the assailants were not strangers. One of them was his own flesh and blood. This is Monsters. Rick Wamsley was a man of simple tastes in many ways. Born in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, a small city made up of around 30,000 people, which is located just north of Tulsa, he grew up loving one thing above all else, and that was football. He loved the gridiron so much he was able to transform himself from a pretty average athlete to a star player by the time he graduated high school. It still wouldn't be enough to earn him a scholarship, though. So when he left school, he had to get into Oklahoma State University on his academic merits. While he was able to do that, in the end he decided that college simply wasn't for him and that what he wanted to do instead was return home and work with his hands. That's what led him to taking up a bunch of menial jobs like fence building and working at a local Walmart. Not exactly the kind of life his parents had hoped he might have. Of course, for Rick's part though, he seemed happy enough. That was until an opportunity came along for him to get a job at the Phillips Petroleum Company as part of their magnetic tower survey crew, something that would allow him to keep doing physical work but also earn a significantly larger paycheck while he was at it. Obviously, Rick took that opportunity and ran with it. And as if that wasn't enough upward momentum for the young man, it was also around then that he reconnected with an old school friend named Susanna, who went by Susie. Susie was at that point studying art at the Oklahoma Christian College. As their renewed friendship quickly blossomed into a romance, she was able to convince Rick to return to college to get a qualification that would help him move up the ladder in the lucrative oil and petroleum industry. So that's what he did, committing himself to his studies once more, all as he and Susie were getting married in 1978. Just 1 year later, on Valentine's Day of 1979, their first child, Sarah, was born. Yes, big changes were happening in the Wamsley household, and even bigger ones were about to come because soon after that, Rick graduated from college and got a job offer with the Shell Oil Company in Houston, Texas. Rick accepted the job and moved his family out to the big city. Of course, at that point, it should come as little surprise that Rick was earning a lot of money. In fact, by the time his second child, Andrew, was born on July 7, 1984, he was considered outright wealthy, a full-blown millionaire. His bank account would only grow as he further climbed the corporate ladder, taking jobs as a comptroller at a company called Utex in Salt Lake City, and then at Meridian Oil in Fort Worth, Texas. But that wasn't the only way he was increasing his assets throughout the 80s. No, he also returned to college for a third time, that time getting a degree in accounting, something that would allow him to start another new job again as an auditor for oil and gas litigation by the time the 90s had rolled around. That new job worked especially well for Rick as it allowed him to primarily work from home, giving him more time to spend with his kids Sarah and Andrew as they moved into a house in the very upscale community of Turnberry Drive in Mansfield. As to what Susie was doing during that period, well, the family not being in desperate need of a second paycheck on account of how much money Rick was earning, she was free to do various small jobs for a while, such as selling antiques on the side, all before she eventually retired to become a full-time mother. Life was good for the Wamsleys as the millennium drew to a close. They loved each other a great deal, they were financially secure, and they had a great relationship with most of the people in their community, with them often hosting dinner parties for their neighbors. Rick and Susie certainly showed their love for one another by springing for expensive gifts and trips around the world. That said, as 2003 came around and their 25th wedding anniversary began to approach, the one thing in their life that could have been described as troublesome was their relationship to their kids. You see, while it seemed like their eldest child Sarah was the picture of success, a very pretty and popular high school cheerleader who just radiated Americana and wholesomeness, underneath the surface things were a lot darker for her. Like with the similar trajectory faced by the character of Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks, a show both Rick and Susie had been fans of when it aired around a decade prior, Sarah was actually something of a wild child. She regularly partied and drank heavily despite still being in her early teens, all while she was also dating men who were much older than she was. Her emotional state eventually got so bad that her parents checked her into a mental health facility at Millwood Hospital in Arlington when she was still only 16. When that wasn't able to turn things around for the young girl, they felt like they had no other option but to kick her out of the house about a year and a half later, just weeks before her graduation in March of 1997. With nowhere else to go at that point, Sarah moved in with her boyfriend at the time, Todd Cleveland. The couple stayed together all the way up until they had a baby together in 1999, a girl named Brittany. Unfortunately, somewhere around that time, Todd started to show an abusive streak, and that left the 19-year-old first-time mother so desperate to escape that she got back in touch with counselors she still knew from Millwood Hospital and asked for their advice on how to proceed. Their advice was that the best thing Sarah could do was leave Todd and take their daughter with her. While that was something she wanted, as time went on she felt that her mental health had degenerated so much again she simply wasn't capable of raising her child alone. That was why, in April of 2001, when she was 22, she checked herself back into the mental health facility with the hope of getting back on her feet and ready to leave Todd once she was discharged. Thankfully, that's what ultimately happened as, by the time 2003 came, Sarah had split from Todd and, despite now being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, had been awarded custody of her daughter. Even her relationship with her parents had been mended somewhat by then, as, desperate to be part of their granddaughter's life if nothing else, Rick and Susie reconnected with Sarah and invited her back into the family. As for what Andrew was doing then, well, he was still living at home and was also going through some major issues of his own with his parents. Like his father, Andrew had grown up a very happy child, someone who was by all accounts a good student at school. Unlike his father, however, Andrew was known to be very difficult to deal with on a personal level on account of his incredibly immature and impulsive attitude. Often described as a jackass by those who knew him, the youngster would cause a lot of problems while he was growing up. Most of that centered around his fractured relationship with his father, one that saw the two get into physical altercations on numerous occasions and even at one point getting the police involved when they were called to the family house over reports of a domestic disturbance. And it wasn't just his father Andrew didn't get along with. No, he and his sister also fought regularly. Then there were the people he worked with at the putt-putt golf complex he found a job at as a teenager. They couldn't stand being around him either. As one of his colleagues would later state, quote, "He thought highly of himself. He was one of those managers that no one wanted to work on his shift." Despite all of that, however, Andrew maintained a very nice lifestyle, one which was largely funded by his parents. They spoiled him so much that after he graduated from Mansfield High School in 2002 and enrolled in Tarrant County College, they gave him a white 1998 Ford Mustang as a celebratory gift. Of course, once he dropped out of college only a year later, they felt betrayed as part of the deal for them helping him out and allowing him to stay at home rent-free had been that he continued with his education. So when he decided he no longer wanted to do that, they cut him off financially. While they didn't kick him out of the house, they did enforce a strict curfew on what times he was allowed to stay out until at night. Obviously, that was not something Andrew was happy with, especially as, near the end of 2002, he started dating Chelsea Richardson, the sister of a high school friend. At that point, Chelsea was still studying at Everman Joe C. Bean High School, though she would graduate in June of 2003. To Andrew, she felt like a breath of fresh air, someone who couldn't be more different to his family if she tried. And while he would quickly find something of a second family in her family, with him being fully embraced by Chelsea's mother, Andrew's parents would not take to his new girlfriend so readily. No, to them she was little more than white trash, someone born on the wrong side of the tracks who, being raised by a poor single mother, didn't meet the expectations of what they wanted for their son. Not that Andrew cared about that, though. In fact, if anything, his parents' disapproval only made him love Chelsea all the more. After all, even if she came from a poor family, she was by all accounts a very bubbly and outgoing person known for making a lot of friends and doing very well at school. So he couldn't see any issue with her, and that was why, as 2003 went on, the pair grew more and more deeply in love, even if some around Andrew did have a few concerns about his partner already. The way they saw it, underneath her facade of being a nice all-American girl, Chelsea was actually something of a manipulator, a girl who had her boyfriend wrapped around her little finger and willing to do anything she asked of him. Even if that was the case, though, Andrew appeared to be fine with the arrangement because by then the pair were making plans for the great life they were going to have together, something that was admittedly difficult to dream about considering Andrew was a college dropout working a minimum wage job, and she was neither studying nor in employment. Sure, Andrew was set to inherit a massive amount of money from his parents one day when they died, but given the fact that they were only in their mid-40s in 2003, it could have been decades before that happened. What they needed, they eventually decided, was to speed that process up, to make sure that money would come into their possession a lot sooner, and that was where another young woman named Susanna Toledano entered the picture. Susanna Toledano was born on September 28, 1984 in Prospect Heights, Illinois, into a Spanish-speaking family. Despite having a good life, making plenty of friends, and doing well at school, once she finished middle school in 1999, her single mother moved her and her two siblings to the warmer climate of Fort Worth, Texas. It was after moving that she first met Chelsea, with the two initially bonding over the fact that neither had a father at home. Of course, given Chelsea was one of the popular girls back then, and Susanna was most certainly not, there was a bit of a power dynamic to their relationship. That led the girl from Illinois to constantly feel like she had to do everything she could to please Chelsea. That was further added to when she started having issues with her mother, causing her to leave home in November of 2002. Susanna moved in with her friend at her home on Leah Place. That would be what led her to do what she ultimately did. Take part in a plot to murder Rick and Susie Wamsley as well as their daughter Sarah so that Andrew could inherit their fortune. Now it's unclear who was the first person to suggest the idea, Andrew or Chelsea, but what is known is that by the autumn of 2003 the plan had already been hatched. It had mostly come together at an IHOP restaurant where Chelsea had first been introduced to Andrew while he was playing a Yu-Gi-Oh card game with her brother a year or so prior. The couple weren't the only two who were involved in the scheme, though. It also involved Susanna, albeit somewhat under duress, and an employee at the IHOP named Ilario Cardenas. Ilario was 24 at the time and had a wife and 4-year-old daughter at home to support. So when the trio, who he was by then familiar with, got talking to him one night while he was working and asked him if he could get them a gun, for a small fee of course, he was surprised but was happy to go along and not ask too many questions. Once they had acquired a weapon, the next step in the plan could be carried out, learning how to use it. It was true that neither Andrew, Chelsea, nor Susanna had ever fired a gun at that point. That was why they went to the house of Ruth Brewstrom, a friend of Chelsea's mother, and asked her to let them engage in target practice in her backyard. The way Chelsea sold it to Ruth at the time, they were just interested in taking up shooting, and with none of their family being willing to let them practice at their own homes, they needed a safe place where they could go to learn how to use their weapon properly. So, ever trusting of Chelsea, Ruth bought the story and agreed to let them do so in her backyard so long as they only fired into the water. They began regularly practicing with the firearm at Ruth's house until December, at which point Chelsea, Andrew, and Susanna abruptly stopped visiting. Ruth found it odd at first, but she soon brushed it off as them losing interest in their new hobby. But the trio hadn't lost interest. No, if anything, they'd only gone deeper into their plans. In fact, back on November 9th, they'd gone as far as to make a failed attempt to kill the Wamsley family. While driving to the town of Joshua, about 30 minutes south of Fort Worth, Rick, Susie, and Sarah's car was shot at by a mystery assailant. As everyone would later learn, that assailant had been none other than Susanna. She had tried to hit the gas tank as she was under the mistaken impression that it would cause the car to explode like it did in the movies. Just a tip, it won't. So, unsurprisingly, that stray bullet never caused the Wamsleys' vehicle to explode. Rather, all it did was freak them out to the point that they called the police. Officers ultimately came to the conclusion that there was nothing sinister going on and that the bullet had likely been fired by a hunter hitting the back of their car accidentally. That said, even back then, Sarah had her doubts about it being an accident, though she had no reason to believe her brother had been involved. She thought it could have been the work of her ex Todd, as he sought revenge over a report she'd made to Child Services about him. You see, at the end of one of the weekends Todd had spent with his little girl Brittany, the child had returned home with some bruises she hadn't had before. That led to Sarah filing a report as she feared her ex had hurt their daughter in some way. So, in her mind, if there was anyone who was going to come looking for vengeance, it would be him. But as it turned out, he had an alibi for his whereabouts on November 9th, and that meant he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. There were no other suspects after that either. Once Todd was proven to have not been responsible, the authorities returned to the idea that it had been a freak accident and that everyone was lucky to have avoided serious injury. So life moved on for the Wamsleys with no real resolution. Their lives continued on as usual until the early hours of the morning on December 11th. At around 3 a.m., after Rick had gone to bed and while Susie was sleeping on the couch in front of the television, Andrew made his way inside and scoped the place out. Then he returned to Chelsea and Susanna, who were waiting outside in his car. As he would explain it to them, while his sister Sarah was not staying over for the night like he had expected, both of his parents were present and asleep, so it was the perfect moment to catch them unawares, something they set about doing as they all entered the house and quietly carried out their work. But while Andrew and Chelsea were all in on the plan at that point, Susanna remained incredibly hesitant. In fact, she wanted nothing to do with being involved in a murder. After being reminded by her best friend that she owed her for letting her live with her, the girl from Illinois eventually caved and did what she was asked to do. Those instructions were to sneak up on Susie while she was asleep on the sofa and shoot her in the back of the head, killing her instantly. Then, once that was done, she was to go into the bedroom where Rick was sleeping and shoot him dead in the same manner. Clearly neither Andrew or Chelsea wanted to get their own hands dirty, but in the end they would have to because after Susanna successfully shot Andrew's mother, she went into the bedroom and fired twice at his father, but she missed him and caused him to wake up. Now realizing he was in mortal danger, Rick leapt out of bed and tried to tackle the girl to the ground, causing her to fire once more at him, hitting him right above the right eyebrow. But even that wasn't enough to keep Rick down. No, seemingly operating on instinct at that point, he continued to fight with Susanna as the scene spilled out of the bedroom and into the living room, alerting both Andrew and Chelsea to what was going on. Obviously then, seeing that things were not going well, Andrew knew he had to act fast. That was why he joined in the fight, trying to hold his father down for long enough for Susanna to shoot him again. Meanwhile, as he was doing that, Chelsea ran into the kitchen and grabbed 2 knives. She quickly returned a moment later and handed one of them to her boyfriend as they both proceeded to stab at Rick. Unluckily for them, though, he proved adept at holding them off, with him only receiving a few superficial wounds. He wouldn't be able to hold them off forever, though. Ultimately, he was outnumbered. While Susanna was back over at the couch using a knife of her own to stab Rick's wife 18 times in order to ensure she was truly dead, Andrew and Chelsea would eventually be able to pin him down. That led to Rick finally recognizing who it was he was fighting with and asking them why they were doing what they were doing. Chelsea simply said that she was pregnant and because of that, they needed the money. That response stunned Rick for a moment, so Andrew took the opportunity to tell Susanna, who had by then finished with his mother, to pick up her gun and shoot his father dead where he lay. While Susanna would indeed fire, hitting Rick again, he still wouldn't die. No, it would take a further 23 stab wounds before he finally passed away on the ground mere feet away from his wife. Once they were done, the trio of killers would begin the process of cleaning up, or at least cleaning themselves up. That meant removing their bloody clothes, quickly washing off the majority of the blood on them in the Wamsleys' bathroom, then driving to Chelsea's ex-boyfriend's house, a man named Jeremy Lavender, where they slept for a few hours. After that, Andrew and Chelsea spent the morning getting rid of the soiled clothes and the knives they had used in the murders, all while Susanna was tasked with burying the gun in the backyard of her friend's house. Of course, while that was happening, the bodies of Rick and Susie remained festering at their property on Turnberry Drive. In fact, it wouldn't be until later that evening that they were finally discovered. The reason they were discovered was because Andrew and Chelsea returned to the house, presumably to do one last check to make sure they hadn't left evidence that might tie them to the crime. Once they were sure they were in the clear, they dialed 911 on the Wamsleys' landline and left the phone off the hook without saying anything. From there, it would only take about 30 minutes for the police to arrive on the scene, by which point Andrew and Chelsea were long gone. 4 officers arrived at the house and discovered the brutal crime scene. Clearly, the 2 people inside the house had been murdered. And what's more, it appeared to be a crime that was done by someone who knew the couple, as there was no signs of forced entry into the house, suggesting the perpetrators were either invited in or had easy access. When detectives Mark Kelly and Max Standifer pulled up at the scene just before 1 a.m. on the morning of December 12th, they knew that the first people they had to question were the friends and family of the deceased. That was going to be the most likely way they'd find the killer or killers quickly. And considering how gruesome the murders had been, this was something that was imperative. As Standifer would later put it when describing what he saw that day, quote, "My experience has been that there are some scenes that are just average, and there are ones that you automatically know you will forever carry with you. This was one of those I automatically knew I would never forget." With that in mind, the first point of call was the Wamsleys' neighbors, and it was while questioning them that the detectives learned that one neighbor, Keith Cowand, remembered hearing what sounded like gunshots the evening prior. When that had woken him up, though, he'd assumed he'd dreamt it, and so he went back to sleep. Before he did, though, he remembered looking at his bedside clock and seeing it read 3:23 a.m. Not only did the police have the date of the murders, they also had the time. All they needed to do at that point was find out who within the Wamsleys circle did and did not have an alibi for that period of the morning of the 11th. Of course, even if they suspected the murders had been carried out by someone close to the couple, they still understood this was a very tough time for the rest of their loved ones, and so they didn't want to go in all guns blazing when trying to get answers. That was why, when they visited Sarah a few hours later at around 4 a.m., they were less accusatory right off the bat and more concerned with the young mother's well-being given what she'd just learned about her parents. Upon hearing about the murders, Sarah became inconsolable, an understandable reaction to such news. The only thing she was able to do at all was muster up the strength to call her paternal grandparents and let them know about the terrible situation. Meanwhile, as that was happening, Andrew was at the home of Jeremy Lavender watching the news report on the unfolding situation at Turnberry Drive, wondering why the police hadn't contacted him yet, a worrying prospect for a guilty mind like his. So feeling the need to make some kind of show of grief, he and Chelsea drove over to his parents' home once more, that time so he could be seen to be in pain. And while there, he also made an effort to try and speak to Detective Standifer. Once Standifer was introduced to Andrew, he took him back to the station for formal questioning. It was there that he was given the story of Andrew having plans to go camping that weekend. plans that were ultimately canceled due to poor weather. So, as the 19-year-old put it, instead of going camping, he and Chelsea decided to hang out at her ex-boyfriend's house over the weekend watching movies. Andrew said that's where he was when he heard the news about his parents. Luckily for the young couple, Detective Standifer believed him, or at least was willing to believe them for the time being. Sure, there were some things about him that gave the detective a moment of pause, such as the deep scratch along the back of Andrew's hand, but that could have come from anywhere. For the time being, he had other people to question, the next being Sarah. Once she'd calmed down a little, the oldest child of the Wamsleys was brought in for questioning too. Not because she was being treated as a suspect, but as it was put to her at the time, as a precautionary measure just so she could be ruled out. And once her story was told, there wasn't much reason to believe she'd been involved. Mostly because of the incident on November 9th when her parents' car had been shot at while she was a passenger in the back. Obviously then, that suggested she'd been a target too during an earlier attempt to kill the couple. So once her fingerprints were taken, she was allowed to go home. As she was leaving, though, she met her brother outside who told her something that chilled her to the bone and made her think for the first time that he might have been involved in their parents' death. As Andrew would tell his sister, he was concerned that if the police searched his car, then they were going to find his parents' blood in it. When asked why their parents' blood would be in his car, Andrew said that their mother had cut her finger in there a few days prior. Sure, that was a plausible explanation, and it made sense it was something Andrew would be worried about, but something about the manner in which he said it to her sent alarm bells ringing inside of her head. Still unwilling to accept the idea that her own sibling could have killed their parents, she brushed the idea aside for the time being. Not that the police were doing the same, though. No, they were checking up on Andrew's alibi when they contacted Jeremy Lavender to ask if he had indeed allowed Chelsea and her boyfriend to stay at his house that weekend. And as it turned out, he confirmed that was true. Or at least it was true they had been there for part of the weekend, though it was evident that if there was any murder plot, he'd not been aware of it. All he'd done was just give a roof to an old flame who he'd remained on good terms with. But it wasn't just Chelsea and Andrew he'd invited into his home on the night of the murders. As police would eventually learn, there was a third person there as well, a young woman who went by the name of Susanna Toledano. When the authorities tried to bring Susanna in for questioning, they had trouble locating her. That was because, following the murders, she moved back to Illinois in order to, in her own words, quote, get away from it all for a while. So it took a while for the investigators to track her down. Once they did, though, it became clear she knew more than she was letting on. That was because, despite her attempts to back up Andrew's story that they had all been staying at Jeremy's house that weekend and knew nothing about the murders until the news reports came on TV, when the subject of a strand of hair that was found in Rick's hand came up, she seemed to grow nervous. She became so nervous that she initially refused to submit herself to a DNA test, though when she realized that was making her look guilty, she eventually relented. After all, that hair could have come from anywhere. But we all know it didn't. It was totally Suzanne's hair, and once the results of the DNA test finally came back in April of 2004, that would be confirmed. At that point, Susanna was arrested and asked to explain how her hair could have ended up in Rick's hand. Not just somewhere in the house, but in the victim's hand, making it clear it had been pulled out during the struggle. Susanna realized that the jig was up and admitted to everything, or almost everything. While the young woman confirmed that she had been at the house of Rick and Susie Wamsley on the night they were murdered, she denied having anything to do with the actual killing. She claimed she had only gone there under duress for what was sold to her as a robbery. It was during the process of that supposed robbery that a fourth person, Ilario Cardenas, had done the deed. Clearly then, the next step for investigators was to track down Ilario. When they found him working at the IHOP restaurant, they questioned him and another side of the story came to light. As he put it, he indeed knew Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna and had even supplied them with a gun, but had nothing to do with the murders and had certainly not been present at the Wamsley house on that fateful evening. By then, he'd been ghosting the trio for a while as he didn't like the path they were headed down. As to what that path had been, well, when pushed further, Ilario admitted that he had been offered additional money by Andrew if he agreed to cut the brakes on Rick and Susie's car. And while he agreed to do that at first, he ended up being too scared to go through with the plan and had started keeping his distance from the trio. Unfortunately for him, though, when he took 2 polygraph tests following that in order to verify his story, he failed the first one. That, combined with the prior testimony of Susanna pointing to him as the one who pulled the trigger, was enough to lead to the authorities formally arresting him and charging him with capital murder on April 6, 2004. And he wasn't the only one being arrested. Again, based on the testimony of Susanna, Andrew and Chelsea were charged with the lesser crime of solicitation of capital murder the following day. Despite the fact that they were all very likely guilty in such a heinous crime, they were all held with less than $1 million bail. But if the media thought that was the most shocking part of the story, they'd be very wrong. Just a few months later, Susanna decided she wanted to come clean with the real story about what had happened during the early hours of December 11, 2003. In exchange for leniency with her sentencing, she confessed to being one of the people who killed Rick and Susie, but her partner in crime wasn't Ilario. No, her partners were Andrew and Chelsea. The reason they'd come up with the plot in the first place was, as investigators had assumed, to get access to their multi-million-dollar fortune. She also explained that the night they committed the murders had not been their first attempt, though. Prior to that, there had been the plan to cut the brakes of the car, and after that there was the failed attempt to shoot them while they were driving to Joshua on November 9, 2003. Susanna admitted that she'd been the actual shooter. When neither of those attempts worked, though, they moved on to breaking into their home in the middle of the night and killing them while they were asleep, presumably in the hopes that it would look like a random home invasion and so there would be no reason to suspect them. But because of their sloppiness, as well as the additional testimony of Susanna, it was looking like they were going to be spending a long time behind bars at best and facing the death penalty at worst. As a result of the crimes taking place in the state of Texas, the death penalty was on the table, or at least it was for Andrew and Chelsea. For Susanna's part, her willingness to cooperate meant she was only charged with murder instead of capital murder, removing her eligibility for the death penalty. And as for Ilario, given he hadn't been present at the time of the murders and had only gone as far as to supply the murder weapon, he was recharged with conspiracy to commit murder. On May 18, 2005, after it was decided that the defendants would be tried separately, Chelsea's trial began first to much media fanfare. Of course, as was expected, she pleaded not guilty. That would lead to the prosecution stating their case that she was not only guilty, but she was in fact the primary guilty party in the sense that she had been the ringleader of the entire operation. That's right, the way the state saw it, Chelsea, a known manipulator, had convinced her boyfriend they needed money fast, and that the best way to get it was to kill his parents. Once she'd gotten him on board, the prosecutor argued the next step in her plan had been to get her friend Susanna on board and convince her to be an accomplice. Then, of course, there was Ilario. As the prosecution put forward, he was brought on board once either Chelsea or Andrew realized he had access to a gun. Basically, all of that was to say that the state's stance was that Chelsea deserved to be executed for her crimes on account of the murders all being her brainchild. Unsurprisingly, the defense would refute that and argue that Chelsea was nothing more than a 19-year-old girl who'd only recently graduated high school, certainly not someone who fit the bill of being the criminal mastermind she was being painted to be. If anything, Andrew was the one who had been the ringleader, as he was the only one who would have had the know-how to do so. In fact, as they claimed, not only was Chelsea not the one who planned the murders, she hadn't even been there when the murders happened. No, with there being no physical evidence to tie her to the scene, and with her claiming to have been absent on the night of the crime, the defense team pushed the idea that it had only been Andrew and Susanna who had murdered Rick and Susie. Any hopes they had of convincing the jury of that were hampered when Susanna took the stand as a witness. At that point, she informed the court that Chelsea had written her a letter while they were both behind bars, asking her to take all of the blame for what had happened, if for no other reason than for the sake of her unborn baby. For Susanna's part, though, she was no longer convinced there was a baby. She finally started to see her friend for what she was, a liar who would do anything she could to get away with murder. So that was why she brought the letter forward and allowed it to be submitted into evidence. For the first time, the prosecution had some physical evidence directly tying Chelsea to the murders, and that wasn't the only smoking gun they had in their possession. On top of that, they also had testimony from Vanessa Dawn Heydrich and Catherine Elizabeth Norton, each of whom had shared a cell with Chelsea at various points, and each of whom independently reported the young woman confessed to them that she'd been the one responsible for the murders at Turnberry Drive. Clearly, that all painted a damning picture for the jury, and that's exactly why on May 26, 2006, almost a year to the day after her trial began, Chelsea Richardson was found guilty of capital murder. Given the severity of the crime and her role within it, the presiding judge felt it was only right to sentence the young woman to death. Andrew seemed to think that there was less hope of getting a fair trial on account of all the news stories surrounding him. That was why he petitioned for his trial to be moved out of Tarrant County, as, if it was somewhere else, he'd be less likely a jury would be familiar with him. In the end, though, the judge decided against it. His trial started on February 27, 2006. Of course, even if Andrew had his doubts about getting a fair trial, he wasn't willing to go down without a fight. His defense would claim that their client was not guilty of murder and there was no proof outside of the word of some unreliable witnesses. They maintained that the real guilty party was Susanna. After all, her hair was the only piece of physical evidence found on the scene. It was the exact same playbook Chelsea's lawyer had used. This time, though, it would have better results because, despite Susanna once more being called to the stand to give her testimony of what happened on the night of the murders, Andrew's legal team did a good job of pushing the idea there was simply no proof he had even been present on that evening. According to the defense, it was equally as likely he had been watching movies at Jeremy Lavender's house as he had originally claimed. In the end, that would be the deciding factor, because while the jury remained convinced Andrew had been involved in the planning of the killings and was likely in the house that night, there simply wasn't enough evidence to show he'd been directly involved in the murders themselves. That meant, while he was ultimately found guilty of capital murder, he was not sentenced to death. Instead, he was given a sentence of life in prison. That might have been disappointing for many who were hoping Andrew would get a more severe punishment. Even his sister seemed to favor death for him. Though his life has been spared, he doesn't become eligible for parole until 2044 when he'll be 60 years old, and there's no guarantee he'll get it. So the world is safe from Andrew Wamsley for the foreseeable future. Susanna Toledano and Ilario Cardenas both cooperated with the state and took plea bargains for their roles in the crime. Susanna was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, and Ilario was sentenced to 50 years with the possibility of parole after 8. They both remain in prison today because, despite now being eligible for early release, Ilario was denied parole at his hearings in both 2016 and 2017. But that's not the end of the story. There would be one final twist involving Chelsea Richardson when she appealed her sentence in 2007 under the argument that her original trial had been biased toward the state after the prosecution was able to gain information about her illegally. While that appeal was rejected, it would ultimately be successful when she tried again in 2011. Because of that, her sentence was commuted to life in prison, also with parole eligibility in 2044. As things stand today, all 4 people involved in the deaths of Rick and Susie Wamsley remain behind bars, but only 2 of them have taken responsibility and have actually shown some amount of remorse over their crime. Andrew actively maintains his innocence, with him at one point telling an interviewer, quote, "I was a spoiled rich kid and got almost everything I ever asked for. Why in the world would I want my parents dead?" Of course, few if any believe he actually is innocent. Rather, as far as the world is concerned, he was a spoiled rich kid who wanted even more. and with the help of his girlfriend and 2 other co-conspirators, went about getting it in the most despicable way imaginable, by killing his own flesh and blood, turning himself from a spoiled rich kid into a monster. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.